Hello, everyone. My name is James. I'm an artist that goes by The Range, and I thought it would be a very fun thing to do my kind of top 10 favorite things of the year. Just as a recap, it's snowing outside, and I think it's kind of a nice thing to do. Um, and I think it would be fun to kind of talk about some of my favorite books or ideas or just things that happened to me this year um, as a way to just have it as a document to kind of recap. So I wanted to just go through my favorite things in no particular order. My first thing is probably one of the artists that was most inspirational to me this year, and that's Bill Evans, specifically a record that he made called Conversations with Myself. Um, I think what sets Bill Evans apart from a lot of the other artists that I listen to is just the level of care and clear practice that he put in over his life. I think most people probably know him from the work with Miles Davis, but I think his individual artist career is pretty spectacular in and of itself. And there's a lot of different records that people probably know, but I'm not sure that many people know about Conversations with Myself. Specifically, this one song called Spartacus Love Theme, which I'll play a little bit here, just so you can get a sense. But what was cool about that record is it was made at a time when it would have been very difficult to do multi-tracking, specifically multi-tracking that was like really kind of on the nose. And the whole record is more or less him playing multiple pianos on top of each other, one in the center channel, one in the left, and one in the right. And I don't know, it's just really spectacular. I'm a huge like counterpoint nerd, and to have someone that's clearly really respectful, kind of the deep Bach method, but also with all the chromaticism and the virtuosity, which the song I think really shows. It's just really impactful to me. It shows how much how much I suck at the piano, frankly, and also how much work I have to do to get to a place where I'm in the same. Um, I don't know, just to even understand the choice of chords and the choice of um, chromaticism on a theory basis, because obviously he's such a virtuoso, I'll never be able to touch it. But it's just I don't know, it's just an immaculate thing, and I can't recommend the record enough. And I hope you all enjoy it. Um, the second thing is I was really lucky this year to go to Marfa, Texas a bunch. I know it's quite a cliche thing, but it was the first time I had ever been this year. And yeah, I can't put my finger on why it was so special, but it was definitely one of my favorite places that I visited this year. And I think specifically learning more about Donald Judd and his work and kind of his ideas, while kind of cliche, I'm sure, to those in the art world. To me, it was the first time I kind of really kind of understood a lot of the main things that he was excited about, specifically permanent installation of pieces. I think a lot about that with my work, and it's increasingly difficult in this kind of environment to have anything feel like it has any kind of lifetime. And it's always been important to me that you make these records or whatever books that can be just as relevant now as they are in 100 years time. And I think whether you love the work or not, I think it's a really interesting idea to specifically set out and have that be a guiding principle. It comes it comes most it's most apparent when you see Chinati for the first time. I think like that was a really special thing, and I think especially the way that he was repurposing this huge disused set of barracks in a way to promote the pieces having their own space was really, really cool to me. I think specifically when I look around in Vermont and see a lot of the kind of disused barns and everything, it's a cool thing to think about what that means up here and have the whole thing. The other thing that I think is a favorite part of my trip is just how much he was committed to the idea of compartmentalization of his work, and he was very lucky to have that much like physical room and real estate. I mean, for those of you that haven't been there, there's literally like, I don't know, 30 odd buildings, if not way more. And so he was able to like take a specific small room and only work on one specific piece of furniture there. And so the whole drafting table is just designed to work on that specific piece of furniture, and the next room over is the same thing. And then he would have, a day bed in one of the other rooms that he would, if he was just kind of needing to sleep overnight or just to take a nap, he could be there and then come back to the room. And I think that's been a really cool thing for me to see in myself this year about how powerful that can be to have, even just simply having one room where I'm recording music and one room where I'm mixing it or thinking about it critically. Like, just to have that separation is really, really special. And I think it's cool to see that actualized in a form that's not mine. I also didn't know how much of a critic he was. So like, I think this book specifically was one I wanted to talk about, was the complete writings. He lays out a lot of the ideas, and you can kind of see pretty quickly how he comes from being like very budding and kind of new to the game critic to where it's like he kind of has his artistic career pretty figured out, and is pretty firm, which is a cool thing to read. So I really I like this book. You can pick it up on Amazon, and yeah, for those that aren't familiar, it's just a really interesting set of ideas, and I hope you both kind of get to read about him as an artist as well as go to see Marfa at some point. It's a cool town. There's also just a lot of really exciting and cool people that live there, and I'm excited to keep going back. My third thing is Dolby Atmos. So for those of you that are not in music, Dolby Atmos is the way that historically Dolby figured out a way to have surround sound for movie theaters, and that's their most recent kind of iteration of their spec for surround sound in movie theaters. But recently, it kind of really hit this year in music that's going to be a format that people use in music, which for the first time, I think has a shot to make surround sound be kind of like the new format. Historically, there's been attempts with like quadraphonic and then with 5.1, where certain records, like I remember even back in school in 2010, people were listening to, specific recordings for that. But because it's been so challenging to have, instead of just two speakers, to have, in this case, 12, let alone a 5.1 setup, it kind of stalled. But with Apple seeming like they're telegraphing that that's going to be a format that they care about for AirPods, specifically, perhaps with some augmented reality thing, or even just the ability now that they can have that be a pretty good approximation of what it sounds like in the room, all of a sudden everyone's very excited about this new format. And I definitely was slow to understand how powerful it was, but I think it's, I don't know, it's something where now you have to consider that could be the format in 10 years that people listen to. The same way, people mixing in mono were really sure that was going to be the thing that stood the test of time. Then 10 years later, stereo blew out, and I don't think anyone listened to like the original Beach Boys on mono, which is the recording that they spent the most time on. And so there's kind of a combination of panic plus excitement that this could be the new thing. And it's a really cool opportunity. I think for the first time, I definitely was lucky to listen to like the John Hopkins album in the room. And there's just things that you can do in this format that you cannot do in stereo, full stop. It makes stereo feel compact and kind of like just a picture hanging on the wall, as opposed to kind of living in a space. That's the analogy that I like, is like stereo is just the kind of picture in a frame that you can look at, whereas Dolby lets you actually be in the gallery, for instance. And so I'm just really excited. Like I'm very convinced that there's going to be some record that ends up being like the Dark Side of the Moon, but of Atmos, where it really explodes this format as a interesting vector that shows that there's stuff that you can't do in stereo that you can do in this format. I mean, there's moments during some records where you feel like you're, I don't know, like in the jungle, and then like in John's record, like a synthesizer would come in, and then all of a sudden you're in this new space, and it's all very exciting, and that kind of, it really adds to the temporal nature of something that I think is, I don't know, I just am in love with the idea that you can do stuff in this format that you can't do in other ways, specifically stereo. You just can't really get at that same sense of space. So I'm optimistic, and I think, yeah, my mind's really, because as of late, it doesn't seem like that many people have considered that a record could be, like its native place could be in Dolby Atmos as opposed to just stereo. Like right now, everyone's just mixing records on stereo, and then Dolby is kind of an afterthought. So I'm really excited on my next album, not that I know that it's going to be a format that's very likely to be something that I consider from the beginning, and think about what that could mean. Like for instance, you can imagine being actually in Carnegie Hall, let's say, like you can really put the orchestra at a distance in the future and have people behind you and people to your right. All these spaces that you would otherwise have to kind of synthetically get out with just two speakers, the phantom image extends the full kind of 360 behind you. So I don't know, I'm just really, really, really excited about what this is going to mean. My fourth thing is, sorry, I have to check my notes. Playing shows again. I think it's pretty obvious, but we didn't get a chance to do that very much over the past couple of years. So to be able to go out and play shows again this year was insane. I think specifically playing Corona Capital and Portola in San Francisco were two huge highlights. Yeah, it just felt amazing. Like it made all the tough times that I went through trying to get Mercury finished really worth it, and it really made everything make sense again in a way that it hadn't. I was definitely struggling with not necessarily seeing the point of finishing my work, or it just all felt very disconnected because it just felt like my music would go out into the ether and I didn't really hear or feel what the response was. But then to be able to actually be in front of people and see it again was a complete return to form for me, and like I felt just very connected again for the first time, which was amazing. My fifth thing is this book by Garry Kasparov called, it's a series, but My Great Predecessors. This is just the first part. I'm unfortunately afflicted with chess addiction, and I'm not good because I started very late, and I don't think I have the trait to be any good at it. But I think it's my favorite thing about chess is that it provides kind of a sense of mental models that are difficult to access elsewhere. Like I'm definitely a broken record to friends thinking about, like, I always talk about, what the chessboard of a certain situation is. Like when you're making a decision with something, what is what's the layout of the board? And it's a helpful mental model to kind of think through things. Or, for instance, just the simple thing of, don't ever let yourself get checkmated. Like that, if that's your rule number one, it's hard for things to go really, really awry. And so I think it provides a lot of these like really interesting ways to help you think through other things, even if, I'm never going to break like 1500 or something. But this book I thought was really interesting, and I had never heard of it before. The whole conceit is he's walking you through games, but it's basically like the important games that lead up to a transition in who the world champion is over time, starting with some of the really, really earliest people, not quite with Paul Morphy, but like going through to Steinitz and then to Lasker and on and on and on. And it's both a really cool kind of narrative history of chess, but also really helpful to kind of walk you through games and how the ideas would change over time, like starting from like really, really attacking chess to more closed form and this kind of swinging of the pendulum back and forth. And it was really helpful to me as a novice to try to understand a lot of the ideas. And I tend to respond well to historicity in general and just really having a lay of the land about what transpired in the past and how you arrive to a certain spot. So I'm excited to finish the set of series. So far, this book has been amazing and really, really helpful, even for someone that doesn't understand all the lines and kind of counter lines that he provides that well. So I really, really can't recommend this one enough. My sixth thing that was a favorite this year is this book. It's called The Principles of Harmony and Contrast of Colors. It was written by a chemist in the 1800s, Chevreul. I'm sure I'm butchering the French, but I picked it up at the bookstore in New York, not really expecting much, but he was kind of a polymath, and this is a specific kind of group of ideas on color theory and how things were started. And I really like this as a metaphor for how different timbres work together in music. I spent the last probably 5 years really deeply thinking a lot about like frequency and level and like the real kind of basic building blocks of music. And I think this represents the thing I'm most interested in now, which is timbral combinations, right? So like, why does a certain synthesizer work even with the same kind of notes and another synthesizer doesn't work? Like, what are the timbral elements that make sense? And I think this was a really interesting book to kind of break down the science of that, along with some other books. There's a Wayne Slauson book that I really like that talks about it in the musical sense, but just trying to kind of build up some intuition, because it's not obvious to me. I'm sure there's a lot of other books that have investigated this much more deeply, but it's not obvious to me that there is a framework for that kind of theory. Like, I don't really know how you would think about grouping those things together and like thinking about, or like even really basic stuff like, why does an electric bass through an amp sound really, really good with a drum kit? Why has that always historically been a combination that people have been drawn to? Like, I don't quite know how to think about that. And so I think it's an interesting thing to draw from other disciplines and kind of think that part through. So I thought this was a really interesting book. And if you can find it, it's great. And it's kind of like a little coffee table book, and it's got a lot of nice little color plates along with the theory and some of the original French text as well. So I can't recommend this one enough. Number 7 is not necessarily this book in general, although this was a really good one, but there's an idea from Da Vinci called Sfumato, which is this idea of kind of smokiness in a lot of his paintings that I found really, really useful. I think in a lot of ways, the surfaces of these paintings, when you inspect them, have a lot of implications for thinking about music and thinking about landscaping in music and thinking about mixes in general. And so I think this idea for me of Sfumato, like specifically thinking about like a picture like this, like how he's able to kind of blend the figure down into darkness, has a lot of ramifications for music and how you think about EQing and choosing subjects. So again, not necessarily for the paintings themselves, but more the kind of ideas. I read a really interesting, I guess it was in the Isaacson biography of Da Vinci, but just how deeply he was thinking about the science of what he was doing. Like, I think that I always knew that was the case with him, but when I read that book, it was clear it was like a compulsion and like basically a complete obsession on his behalf of like really inspecting every possible thing, like maybe almost to a point of craziness. And I think when I looked at this book and really study a lot of the work up close, like this is another example of just how detailed and like specific he was thinking about. Like, there's obviously a lot of little cracks, but to how you roll off into a black, even in a situation when you're like just experimenting with like a shade of brown and how that interacts with light and everything, was something that he was thinking about a lot, and I think has a lot of ramifications for how you create a sense of depth in music, specifically now that I've been thinking a lot about Dolby Atmos and that this year. I think it's kind of a special thing, and definitely is something that's been hiding in plain sight. Like, I think I knew about Leonardo and have been a fan of his work for a long time, again, to the point of cliche, I'm sure, to all of you in the art world. But I really, really enjoyed this book, but also that idea set in general of like thinking about that technique in music as well. Yes, number 8. This one was another favorite of mine this year, is this book, which is the OED. I think it's cool to me. I've always wanted an Oxford English dictionary and finally have the room for it here. And I thought this one was a really cool one. It's quite heavy, but to be able to have the whole thing in a really, really small form and not have it take up an entire shelf was really a cool find for me. I think specifically my favorite feature of this one is just how small the text is. It's super, super tiny, to the point where, and this is my favorite feature of this, you have to have a tiny little magnifying glass to be able to see everything. Definitely is a reminder of my grandma with her encyclopedia. And yeah, I don't know. I think one thing that I started to do this year was to have the internet switch off at a certain time of the day at the router level. So like, there's been times when it's at 7:30 p.m. Right now it's at 1:30 in the morning, where the internet, like, I have no control over it, but it just turns off and I don't have access to anything online. And it's been a really nice way to disconnect. It ended up being like a really nice time to like watch a film that I had always been wanting to see, but never really, got around to it, or it wouldn't be something that I would naturally go to on HBO or Netflix or something. But it also obviously ended up being a really wonderful time to read. And I thought that this book was great in case I was reading something from like the early 1900s or late 1800s where there was a word I didn't understand, or frankly, I think a lot of the kind of vocabulary is a lot more elevated in that time frame. And so to have like the Samuel Johnson connection was pretty cool with this, and have it be something that I could just access quickly and not have it interrupt the fact that I didn't have a way to access the dictionary online is cool. And I think there's just something nice about, like, I remember in English class in high school first seeing it, and it kind of being this triviality that you could have all of the etymology in the same spot as you were looking at the definition, all the different uses. But I think I've been surprised at how much it's helped me understand context of a word and the etymology, specifically when I was going back and reading stuff that's a lot older, that a word might have fallen out of use or had a very different use case at the time that it was being used. And I think this gives you a really good sense of that. So yeah, I can't recommend it enough. And I mean, maybe someday I'll get the full one where the text isn't super small, but I really, really like this one because it's kind of a fun little extra daily thing that I get to do. Number 9, we're coming to the end, I promise, is I am kind of back in love with the place that I live. So I haven't been super public about it, but in a couple years ago, I moved from New York to Vermont with the idea of starting a studio up here and kind of converting an old A-frame to being my my residence, but also having, a live room and a mixing room and all that thing. So I didn't really think that deeply about where I was going. It was just kind of where I could afford, and but still be able to access New York. At the time, I was still kind of splitting time. And then during the pandemic, I moved up here full time, and kind of, for better or for worse, was here. And it's a very, very rural place. Like, my favorite anecdote is that there's only half the people in my whole town as there were in my building in New York. So it's really, really rural, and there's days and weeks that I don't really see anyone up here. But I just feel very lucky that I get to have access to nature, like, right at my front door. Like it's, right outside. And I just am feeling very, very lucky that I get to kind of live here. It feels very, very special. For those of you that know me, I'm like a total evangelist for the state in general. And I think I'm really, really just happy to be here. And it's been like something that during the pandemic, I was really being a little woe is me about, because I just hadn't seen anyone for so long. But now it's been a really, really nice feeling to, when I'm away and on a trip or playing a show or traveling, to have that missing of a place, and missing the mountains and missing the nature and missing the seasons and everything. It's been a nice feeling to kind of feel lucky again to be here. And yeah, I don't know. I'm just feeling really, really excited. And then my last thing is probably pretty obvious, but I'm really happy that my album Mercury was out this year. It was 5 years since Potential, more than 5 years. I think that came out in 2016. Yeah, I guess that's a full 6 years. And it was a huge struggle. I went through like an insane bout of depression for a really long time during the making of that album. And it made it challenging to, I think I was musically struggling, trying to push myself, as well as that was a bit of a 1-2 punch, and made it really, really hard to finish. But to finally have it out and to have it come out as well as it did and be so proud of it, and like I said earlier, to be able to play it live has been amazing. I tend to think about my albums as these kind of bookends that I get to put on in my life. So like Nonfiction was that period from like 2012 to 2014, or 2012 to 2013, and Potential was the delta between that and 2016, and then this represents that whole time. So I think I'll look back on it and really remember the good times and the bad times, but hopefully mostly remember it as kind of a victory over a pretty dark time in my life, and like be so proud that I kind of overcame it, because it was really challenging. I think it was a frustrating time to have songs feel like they were so close to done but yet so far, and I'm just so happy that it's finally out and done now. And I think it's something that I hope you all really enjoyed, and will continue to enjoy over the next year. I know I'm really excited to continue to tour it next year. And yeah, so it's just a really nice feeling that it's out, and it's made me excited to make more music and continue over the next year. So yeah, I hope some of these books have been interesting to you. I hope some of the concepts have been good. I definitely enjoyed talking about them, and hopefully there's some stuff that you hadn't heard of before. And yeah, feel free to kind of drop me a line on any of the topics that you find interesting. I'm curious to see if someone has any other books that are kind of in line with my interests. And yeah, I hope it's good. Again, I'm James, and I hope you have a great holiday season, and I look forward to talking to you again next time. Okay, bye.